Truth Triumphant by B.J. Wilkinson. Chapter 12. AIDAN and the Church in England. Not Augustine of Canterbury, but devotish Irish Gaels in every valley of the Heptarch, Aidan, Finnan, Coleman, Maldub, Diuma, and others, first carried the evangel of Christian culture to the savage English tribes. Patrick in Ireland, Columba in Scotland, and Inuit in Wales were apostles to a people using the Celtic tongue. Aidan, on the other hand, a disciple of Columba's Celtic school, was called to be an apostle to a different race, the pagan Anglo-Saxons of England. During its 600-year Anglo-Saxon period, the conversion of England stood as a monument to the missionary zeal of Aidan. The pagans, in conquering Britain by the sword, had all but destroyed the primitive British Church. Nearly 200 years later, this same evangelical church, not connected with Rome, through Aidan and his successors, subdued practically two-thirds of their heathen conquerors by the power of the gospel. The 7 kingdoms of the Heptarchy, into which England was divided in Aidan's days, were as jealous as one another as the Balkan states today. Mercia in the center was the largest. The next largest, occupying the northeast portion of the realm, was Northumbria, where Aidan began his great work. South of Northumbria, along the coast, were, in succession, East Anglia, Essex, the kingdom of the East Saxons, Kent, and Sussex, the kingdom of the South Saxons. To the southwest of these lay the 7th member of the Heptarchy, Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons. To the east and north of these pagan Anglo-Saxon kingdoms lay the Celtic Christian lands of Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. And to the southeast, across the English Channel, was the kingdom of the Franks, which was ruled over by papal sovereigns. Aidan came from Iona, which had grown into a well-equipped university. Scholars of renown filled its chairs of instruction. This fact so impressed Dr. Samuel Johnson, the interesting figure in English literature, that he wrote, We were now treading that illustrious island which was once the luminary of the Caledonian regions, whence savage clans and roving barbarians derived the benefits of knowledge and the blessings of religion. Many travelers of the high seas occupied the guest house at Iona during the student life of Aidan, so that he was devoted eagerly to the knowledge imparted by navigators from Iceland in the north, from the Holy Land in the south, and from other distant parts of the world. He must also have known considerable about the 7 kingdoms of pagan England, since many Angles came into Caledonia either as fugitives or captives taken by the warring Scots. 2 events occurred which singled out the call of Aidan as one of an unusual nature. The assembly of Iona selected one of their students to go in answer to the request of King Oswald of Northumbria as an evangelist. Though distinguished by the austerity of his life and for his learning, the one selected quickly returned home, complaining, like the 10 spies of old, of the fierce people and of the great obstacles to overcome. He lacked the faith to serve, however much he loved to shine. Another student in the assembly who advocated love, gentleness, and patience in winning the Anglo-Saxons was chosen. This was the youthful Aidan. The second unusual factor in the case was the remarkable career of Oswald, ruler of the land to which Aidan was called. In early youth, Oswald knew of the national hatred of his pagan people for the Britons, which led to the slaughter of 1,200 students. He had also witnessed the conversion of his pagan father to the superficial Christianity advocated by Paulinus, a priest sent from Kent. Later, the priest fled when, at the death of Oswald's father, Northumbrians lapsed into idolatry. Oswald himself was compelled to flee his own land and find asylum at Iona. Then the love of his countrymen for his family revived, and Oswald was summoned to the throne. Paulinus, the Roman bishop, was still alive and near at hand, but Oswald wanted his people in Northumbria to walk in the ways of Columba, so he passed this priest by and sent to Iona for a leader. Rome's mission to the Kingdom of Kent. Northumbria was not the only Anglo-Saxon kingdom which, after it lapsed from Romanism into idolatry, was won to Christ by the Celtic Church. In fact, the history of the whole 1260-year period reveals that it was the Church in the wilderness and papal lands that helped, by virtue of its competition, to keep the Roman Catholicism alive. When it was removed or destroyed in certain areas, the standards of Christianity quickly began to fall. Such was the case in Essex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Kent. To understand this, and to follow the great work of Aidan and his successors, consideration should be given to the labors of Augustine and his 40 monks who came to Rome, to Canterbury in 597. Following the instruction from Pope Gregory to Augustine, after the latter, through the efforts of Bertha, the Catholic wife of the pagan king Ethelbert, had secured for him and his monks a footing in Kent, is worthy of notice. At first it was Gregory's intention, which he intimated indeed to King Ethelbert, to have all the temples of idolatry destroyed, but on mature reflection he altered his mind and dispatched a letter to the abbot of Miletus, in which he declared that the idol temples, if well built, should not be destroyed, but sprinkled with holy water and sanctified by holy relics, and should be converted into temples of the living God, so that the people might be more easily induced to assemble in their accustomed places. Moreover, the festivals of honor and of idols, which the rude people had deprived, should be replaced by others, either of the anniversaries of the consecration of churches, or on a day devoted to the memory of the saints, whose relics were deposited in them. On such days, people should be taught to erect arbors around the church, in which to celebrate their festive meals, and thus beholden to thank the giver of all goods for the temporal gifts. Being thus allowed to indulge some sensual enjoyments, they could easily be easily more led to those which are inward and spiritual. As the methods which Augustine employed, the following is from the historian Albert Henry Newman. By making a parade of ascetical life, by pretending miracles, and by promising advantages, they succeeded in converting Ethelbert, the king of the Saxons, who with about 10,000 followers received baptism in the river at the hands of the missionaries. A firm alliance having been formed between the king and the Roman see, the missionaries addressed themselves to a far more difficult task of subjecting the British Christians to Rome. When all other means proved unavailing, they persuaded the Saxon king to make an expedition against them. 3,000 British Christians were slaughtered on one occasion. For the centuries, the Christians of old British type in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, as well as various parts of Germany, resisted with all their might the encroachments of Rome, and it is probable that Christianity of this type was never wholly exterminated. Aidan's missionary labors. In direct contrast to the method employed by Augustine in Kent stands the manner in which Aidan labored for Northumbria. John Lingard, a defender of the papacy, writes, "As soon as he received the episcopal ordination, he repaired to the court of Oswald. His arrival was a subject of general exultation, and the king condescended to explain in Saxon the instructions which the missionary delivered in his native language. But the success of Aidan was owing no less to his virtues than his preaching. The severe austerity of his life, his profound contempt of riches, and his unwearied application to the duties of his profession, won the esteem, while his arguments convincing the understanding of his hearers. Each day the number of proselytes increased, and within a few years the Church of Northumbria was fixed on a solid and permanent foundation." The character of Aidan was well balanced. In religious favor he was second to none of the great church leaders. His industry was amazing. He was never idle. In him was that flame of living fire which blazed forth so gloriously in the hands of many young missionaries sent from the schools of Patrick and Columba. Of him, Beatty says, "It was the highest commendation of his doctrine with all men which he taught no otherwise than he and his followers had lived. For he neither sought nor loved anything of this world, but delighted in distributing immediately among the poor whatsoever was given him by the king or rich men of the world. He was wont to traverse both traverse both town and country on foot, never on horseback, unless compelled by some great urgent necessity. And wherever in his way he saw any, either rich or poor, he invited them, if infidels, to embrace the mystery of the faith, or if they were believers, to strengthen them in the faith, and to stir them up by words and actions to alms and good works. The good work spread to other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. What thrilling encouragement this evangelical movement among these pagan neighbors must have given to those of like faith, who in Persia and the Far East were laboring for the conversion of the heathen. One medieval historian breaks forth in admiration as he attempts to tell what God had done for King Oswald. He enumerates all the nations, the Britons, the Scots, the Petes, and the English, and the provinces of Britain that were brought under Oswald's dominion. Aidan was a man of prayer. He withdrew into his closet and shut the door. On bended knees he poured forth his fervent supplications to God. He had a clear perception of truth and duty, and he exercising a saving, transforming influence on all who were around him. He exhibited great tenderness in his labor for the sinner, and in his efforts to relieve the poor and afflicted. He is said to have been deeply concerned for the welfare of the poor, and have devoted much attention to ransoming slaves. Beatty, while expressing plainly his disapproval of Aidan's refusal to accept papal doctrines, takes great pleasure in saying that this missionary was careful to omit none of the things he found in the apostolic and prophetic writings, but that the utmost of his power he endeavored to perform them all. Aidan was also a founder of church schools and training colleges. At the beginning of his ministry, King Oswald assigned to him the island of Lindisfarne. This was situated on the eastern coast of Northumbria, near the capital of the kingdom, but sufficiently off the main thoroughfare to give the proper surroundings to an educational center. Taking Iona as a model, Aidan did for England through this mother college what Columba had done for Scotland. The fields were used to give work to support the students, as well as to furnish food for the faculty and pupils. It was the purpose of the Celtic Church to plant many centers rather than concentrate numbers and wealth in some ecclesiastical capital. Aidan and his followers limited the buildings to the necessities of the schools. On the location of Lindisfarne and its influence in creating similar institutions, John Lingard says that in all his toil, Aidan kept his eyes fixed on his patron, Columba. From Aidan's first institution, similar training centers were established in the kingdoms of Bernicia, Deira, Mercia, and East Anglia. Aidan's work was a triumph for truth. Firstly, paganism was swept away and replaced by religion founded on New Testament doctrines. Only 30 years was spanned by Aidan and his immediate successors, Finan and Colman. In apportioning these years, Beatty gives 17 to Aidan, 10 to Finan, and 3 to Colman. And yet in that brief period, the Celtic Church grew and prospered, so that John Messenier says, "The original Celtic Christianity had thus a very powerful hold on the country at the time when the first Roman emissary landed in Kent." Edward Hume writes that Aidan was the apostle of England. Celtic Church Training Centers. The chief instrument of Aidan's success was the training school. In naming these evangelical colleges, many writers call them monasteries, using the term in its ancient sense. W.M. Hetherington presents an additional proof that the East was the homeland of early British Christianity, and that the term monk and monastery, as used by ecclesiastical writers of that age, did not mean segregated congregations of unmarried men, as writers generally now use the expression. These words meant rather the pupils of British theological seminaries were married men and were frequently succeeded in their offices and duties by their own sons. This author further claims that wherever the Chaldees or Celtic Christians founded new settlements, the presiding officer of the board or directors was chosen by election, not appointed by some foreign superior. Here he was, in fact, nothing more than the first among equals. Archbishop James Ussher writes that our monasteries in ancient lands were the seminaries of my ministry, being as it were so many colleges and of learned divines, whereunto the people did usually resort for instruction, and from whence the church was wont continually to be supplied with able missionaries. Furthermore, the learned Joseph Bingham takes considerable pains to prove by past authorities that monk and monastery originally had different meanings from those given to the words now. Soon after the establishment at Lindisfarne, AIDAN found Melrose on the Tweed River as a second training field. Although for centuries since the shadows have crept daily across the vacant fields where once stood this Columban college, yet splendid memorials still remain to show its noble contribution to civilization. Whitby as a training center. Another such institute, probably the most famous of all Columban spiritual headquarters in England, was Whitby in the kingdom of Northumbria. Two celebrated names, Hilda and Caedmon, are connected with this history-making center. Whitby is remembered particularly because of the celebrated abbess Hilda. She was of royal descent and from the age of 13 was well known for her piety and consecration to the Christian faith. When paganism arose in Northumbria after the superficial work done by Augustine, Hilda left the country and went to the south, probably to East Anglia. Then came the great news that King Oswald was on the throne of her native land. Having distinguished herself by a noble work in 2 training centers, she returned to Northumbria and undertook either to build or to arrange a Bible seminary at Whitby. Beattie relates that AIDAN and other religious men knew her and honored her work. Because of her innate wisdom and inclination to service of God, they frequently visited with her and diligently instructed her in the doctrines. Even kings and princes asked and received her advice. She put the seminary at Whitby under efficient and scholarly discipline. The establishment was very large, having 2 separate divisions, one for each sex. This latter arrangement was unusual. She obliged all those who were under her direction to attend much of the reading of the Bible and to learn how to teach scriptural truths. There is ample evidence that this type of training under this established there is ample evidence that this was the type of training center established throughout the world by the church in the wilderness. A speciality was made of studying the scriptures and copying the Holy Scriptures. Farming and other trades were taught. To the girls, instruction was given suitable to their later life. Whitby became the nursery of eminent men, graduating 5 who became provincial directors, and giving to the world Caedmon, the first of the English religious poets. Dugdale says that Hilda was a professed enemy to the extension of papal jurisdiction in this country, and opposed with all her might the tonsure of priests and the celebration of Easter according to the Roman ritual. In the crisis precipitated in the National Convocation, when the contending papal and British delegates met at Whitby in 664, Hilda was found on the side of the successor of AIDAN. Many other training centers beside Whitby were established by the Scots in Great Britain and Ireland. Caedmon. The grace of the Lord made use of the simple custom in one of these training centers to bring forth a leader. It seems that at certain entertainments a harp would be passed around from one individual to another, and each was expected to compose an impromptu poem and play the harp in accompaniment. Caedmon, being a simple cowherd, felt so deeply his inferiority that one night, when the harp was passed to him, that he refused to make an attempt, and retired to the stable where he had charge of the cattle. It seemed that a man appeared to him in his sleep and greeted him, saying, "Sing, Caedmon, some song to me." He answered that he could not, and that it was because of this that he had left the feast. The visitor answered him, "However, you will sing to me." "What shall I sing?" asked the humble youth. "The beginning of created things," commanded the voice. Immediately he began to sing and compose to the praise of God. When this was reported, Hilda, always seeking for gifts among her students, requested him to relate the dream and to repeat the words he had heard. Beatty says, "They all concluded that the heavenly grace had been conferred on him by our Lord." The students of the abbey delighted themselves in exercising the gift that they had discovered in Caedmon. They gave him passages from the Holy Scriptures, which, when translated into English, he immediately converted into harmonious verse and sweetly repeated to his masters. Beatty writes, "He sang of the creation of the world, and of the origin of man, and the history of Genesis, and made many verses on the departure of the children of Israel out of Egypt, and their entering into the land of the promise, while many other historians from Holy Writ, the incarnation, passion, resurrection of our Lord, and his ascension to heaven, the coming of the Holy Ghost, the preaching of the apostles, also the terror of the future judgment, and the horror of the judgments, by which he endeavored to turn away all men from the love of vice, and to excite that in them the love and application to good action." The sermons wrought into verse by Caedmon captured the hearts of England. Caedmon loved sacred subjects. Composed in the people's language, these elevating themes could be sung by all circles. For the first time, the common people enjoyed the wonderful words of life in hymns they could understand. In those days, when there was no printing press, Caedmon, through singing, gave the message that AIDAN and his disciples set forth by preaching. Finan. At AIDAN's death, Finan was chosen in his place. He carried forward the work begun by his able successor. When Finan evangelized the kingdom of Mercia, it held a dominant position in the Heptarchy, for it was located in the center of England and was inhabited by a brave and warlike people. Through the influence of a warlike ruler, Penda, the kingdom was given to idolatry. Now, Penda's son, Peda, a most exemplary young man, open-minded and resourceful, was in love with Elfleda, the daughter of King Oswy of Northumbria, the brother of who was the brother of Oswald. When he sought the hand of the girl in marriage, the father refused on the basis that he was not a Christian. But he requested Peda to receive instructions in the teachings of Christ, and to work for the conversion of the southern part of Mercia, over which his father had set him ruler. When he learned the gospel and was taught concerning the resurrection and the future of immortal life, he rejoiced in his newfound light, and informed Elfleda's father that it was his great desire to become a Christian, whether he secured the girl or not. Thereupon Finan set out to Peda with a large retinue of earls, soldiers, and servants. After Finan had baptized the young prince, he left behind further to instruct him and his people 4 pastors of the Celtic Church: Cedd, Ada, Betty, and Diuma. The last named minister was of Scottish blood, while the others were English. When these three pastors arrived at the province of the prince, they preached the word of God, which were gladly received by many of the nobility as well as by the common people. Many renounced their idolatry and were baptized. The East Saxons. From the kingdom of Mercia, we turn to Essex. A study of the religion of the Eastern Saxons reveals again the superficial work of papal missionaries. Following his first success in Kent, Augustine ordained Meletius as Bishop of Sabert, king of the East Saxons. Many were baptized, and it looked as if Meletius had done a good work. Upon the death of Sabert, however, his 3 pagan sons immediately made an open profession of idolatry, which they had previously renounced. They granted the people liberty to serve idols, and when they saw that the Romanish bishop celebrating Mass and giving the wafer to the people, they argued with the priest. Finally, they forced the bishop and his followers to depart from the kingdom. Immediately, Meletius fled to the 2 papal bishops of the kingdom of Kent. All 3 agreed it would be best for them to leave England, so they withdrew into France. Under Finan, the Christian faith was again established among the East Saxons, and this time the Celtic Church brought the message. The Essex king, Sigebert, and his friends were baptized. After his baptism, the king called the Celtic missionaries to his kingdom. Thus the Celtic Church was the instrument in God's hand of making Christianity prevail over idolatry in the kingdom of Essex. Finan recognized how God was working with the church and missionaries in Essex. Following the example of Columba and Aidan before him, he established a theological training center at Tilbury. It has been shown how the three kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and Essex were brought back from their idolatry by the faith of the Celtic Church, though it consecrated the labors of the Scots. Through the consecrated labors of the Scots. Speaking of the magnificent work done by the Celtic Church in these kingdoms, the historian Rapin de Thoras writes, Augustine has had the error of converting the English, when in the main of the progress he made was not very considerable. 'Tis true, he preached to the Saxons of Kent, as Mellitus did those of Essex, and that with good success. Augustine, at the height of his success, for which he has been so greatly honored, established but 2 bishops only, Justus of Rochester, in his own Kent, and Mellitus at London, though the Pope had expressly ordered him to settle bishops wherever there should be occasion. This is clear evidence that the process ascribed to him was not considerable, as Gregory imagines. It is therefore surprisingly strange that the conversion of the English should be ascribed to Augustine, rather than to Aidan, to Finan, and to Colman, to Cedd, to Duima, and the other Scottish monks, who undoubtedly labored much more abundantly than he. But here lies the case. These last had not their orders from Rome, and therefore must not be allowed any share in the glory of this work. The historian Soemens writes upon the same theme. Only 2 centuries, therefore, north of the Thames were even under Roman superintendence during the transition from paganism to Christianity, and these 2 were London to Edinburgh, has granted full gratification. These 2 were largely indebted to the domestic Scottish zeal for their conversion. Every other country, from London to Edinburgh, has had full gratification appointing the ancient Church of Britain as its nursing mother in the Christian holy faith. The Church in Kent, Wessex, East Anglia, and Sussex. What now should be said of the 4 other kingdoms, Kent, East Anglia, Sussex, and Wessex? Kent, being the kingdom of the southeastern part of England and the farthest away from the missionary advance of the Scots, had been early entered by Augustine. The Christianity which prevailed in this province, therefore, was of the papal type. Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, was farthest away from either the Scottish or the papal advance. Therefore, it long resisted any profession of Christianity. As to the country of the East Angles, here again it was the influence of the Scottish missionaries which reclaimed it to Christianity when, after the departure of the Roman monks, it had fallen into idolatry. A few years after this lapse into paganism, a Scottish pastor labored so diligently among them that great numbers of the apostates were led to renounce their errors and return to the faith. As for Sussex, the kingdom of the South Saxons, it was greatly indebted to the Celtic Church for the knowledge of Christ. Their king had been baptized in the province of the Mercians by the evangelical Scots. Even under the Roman Catholic province of the West Saxons, it was the labors of Scottish missionaries which efficiently helped the Anglo-Saxons therefore depart from their paganism and embrace the gospel. It is no exaggeration to say that, with the exception of Kent and Sussex, the whole of the English race received their foundation of their faith from Celtic missionaries, and even in Sussex it is known that Irish missionaries were at work before the arrival of Wilfrid. As the celebrated Count de Montalembert, French Catholic scholar, wrote, Northumbrian Christianity spread over the southern kingdoms. Coleman. After the death of Finan, Colman was chosen as his successor to lead the Celtic Church. Beattie says that he was sent from Scotland. Colman came to preach the word of God to the English nation. The Scots sent him to Lindisfarne. Therefore, his consecration and his field of labor were identical with those of AIDAN and Finan. The kingdom of Northumbria. Since, however, at the time Oswy, king of Northumbria, was a leader amongst the kingdoms of England, Colman would naturally be a leader of the leaders. He possessed the meekness of Christ. Step by step, British Christianity successfully met entrenched paganism and decadent Romanism and advanced into province after province. Suddenly the wind changed. The intrigues of the Roman Catholic Queen of Oswy succeeded. When Colman had been in office only 3 years, the actions of the Queen precipitated the Council of Whitby. 3 things were against Colman. First, the short time in which he had been in office. Secondly, the fact that his antagonist, Wilfrid, had been drilled in the ways of the papacy. And lastly, the intrigue of the Roman Catholic Queen. The main question of dispute was the same as that between Augustine and Denuth, the same which had led Victor I, Roman Archbishop, to excommunicate the clergy of the East: the date of the observance of Easter. In other lands, the sword was used against those who refused to accept the practices of Rome. Eanfled, the Roman Catholic Queen of Oswy, was determined to bend the king to the practices of Rome. The Queen's chaplain, Wilfrid, was one of the most determined opponents of the Celtic Church. He had been sent to Rome, where for 4 years he had looked upon the gorgeous rites and temples of the papacy. During this time he had been drilled in the arguments and traditions designed to spread Roman's authority, and he returned to Northumbria with the purpose of forcing the Celtic Church to come into line with papal practices. Public debate is exactly what Wilfrid sought, and in order that a decision might be proclaimed in favor of the papacy. The weakness of the king assured this victory in advance. Oswy decreed that both parties should meet in open forum. The place chosen was Whitby. Oswy presided over the council. Colman, his Scottish clerks, the Abbess Hilda and her followers, Bishop Cedd, were on the side of the Scots. The king, his son, Prince Alchfrid, the queen, and the 2 able Romanist priests, besides Wilfrid, were on the side of Rome. None can read the report of the discussion handed down from the papal historian Beattie without realizing how skillfully Colman answered the arguments in the case. However, Wilfrid artfully brought the debate around the supremacy of Peter. It is informing to know that although this question was nowise in the real point of the issue, the Roman divines heaped derision on the great Columba as Wilfrid shouted, "As for you and your companions, you certainly sin if you, having heard the decrees of the apostate see and of the universal church, you refuse to follow them. For though your fathers were holy, do you think their small number in a corner of the remotest island is to be preferred above the universal church of Christ? And if that Columba of yours was as a holy man and as powerful in miracles, yet he could be preferred before the most blessed prince of the apostles, to whom our Lord said, 'Thou art Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And to thee I will give the keys of the kingdom of heaven.'" Immediately the king broke in. "Is it true, Colman, that these words were spoken by Peter to our Lord?" When Colman replied in the affirmative, endeavoring at the same time to show the fallacy and weakness using the incident of the keys as a basis for church supremacy, his remarks were considered beside the point. The king led the audience to increasing indecision until they finally renounced their former custom and decided to conform to the pretended superiority of the papal Easter. It is not difficult to see why King Oswy surrendered to the pressure of the Queen and her chaplain. Through alliance with the kings of Europe, Rome was laying broad and deep the foundations of her theocracy. The new line of kings, the descendants of Charlemagne, was rising to dominance on the continent and carrying the papacy with them. The decrees of the general councils of the papacy were supreme. Kings of even greater resolution than Oswy would have weakened before the pressure. The 4 centuries following Whitby. Some have asked why Colman and his accompanying workers immediately left for the island of Iona. How could he have done otherwise? If he had rallied his forces to fight the king and the foreign priests, such a plan might have torn the church organization, which had been so ably built up by AIDAN and Finan. He remembered that when the fierce persecutions fell upon the infant church in Jerusalem, the apostles left the city, so that the assaulting opposition was turned aside from the truth. Thus, we can see the wisdom of Coleman in departing immediately from his co-workers. During the 4 centuries that followed the Council of Whitby, the northward extension of the Roman Church was checked by racial warfare and pagan invasions, which built up additional barriers between north and south. In the providence of God, Coleman's departure could not have been better timed. The papacy was not permitted a widespread enjoyment of a questionable victory at the Council of Whitby, as many historians have stated. Before Wilfrid and his successors could accomplish the destruction of the Celtic Church, the design for which he had been trained at Rome, the Danes swept down upon England, bringing with them a new flood of paganism. However, when the leaders of the British Church had departed, the representatives of the Rhodism immediately seized the spiritual overlordship of the realm. The year following Whitby, the Pope Vitalian wrote a letter to King Oswy concerning the appointment of an archbishop for Canterbury, in which he said, "By protecting the hand of God, you have been converted to the true and apostolic faith." Pope Vitalian told the king that he would root out the enemy tares. He further promised to send the relics of the Apostle Peter and Paul along with the letter. Not long after, the king's son Alfred discovered and banished the Scottish sect. This injustice was inflicted by King Alfred upon the Scottish believer with the approbation of his father Oswy, because the Scots refused to conform to a church which sanctioned the relic worship. Although the papacy had secured ascendancy in England, God did not permit the truth to die. The seeds sown by Aidan, Finan, and Coleman through dormant were not lifeless. The faith represented by the Catholic leaders remained powerful in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and in the southwestern part of England. Followers of the truth of the Celtic Church, previously described, persisted down through the centuries, so that when Wycliffe began his marvelous revival centuries later, his followers were sought by some to have been those who were maintained from generation to generation the doctrines of AIDAN. During the 400 years from Whitby to the Norman conquest, the papacy in England proper had never been able to overcome totally the paganism of the Danes, or the inspiring courage of the Celtic believers. Therefore, the Church of Rome saw that if it was to win, a new plan of battle must be devised. Time and circumstances placed in its hands a leader destined to bring about a change in the British Isles. This champion was William of Normandy. The papacy and William the Conqueror. The papacy favored the conquest of England by William of Normandy. There were 3 reasons for this. The Danes, in conquering the Anglo-Saxon England, AD 820, were imbued with such a pagan background that Rome could never expect a strong ascendancy through them, even though in later years they had leanings towards that faith. This might even have meant a victory for the ancient Celtic Church, which had already shown itself spiritually able to win both Anglo-Saxons and Danes. Therefore, the papacy welcomed the hour when a strong Norman leader in France, with an apparent claim to the throne of England. In the second place, something had to be done to break the power of the Celtic Church, particularly in Scotland and Ireland. Finally, it was necessary to have a new race upon which to build. The Normans, whose fatherland was France, were living under the leadership of some people whom the Pope had entitled the eldest daughter of the Church. They had enthusiasm for political combination of colorful superstition, a tyrannical caste system, and regal pomp. If the Normans could lay an iron hand upon the Saxon and Danish England, the whole of the British Isles might be brought under the papal flag. When William of Normandy landed in England in 1066 with his warriors, the Danish king Harold had just been called to fight in the north a terrible battle with a rebellious rival. Obliged to move south by forced marches to meet Norman invaders, his wearied army drew up to the heights of Hastings. but it could not withstand the invaders, and the battle was won by the Normans. The victory at Hastings brought new leadership for the Roman Church in England. A powerful reorganization of English life, customs, and institutions followed. Nevertheless, 300 years passed before the combined powers of the continental Roman Catholicism and the Norman prowess could bring Ireland and Scotland under the dominance of the papacy. Wales was not subdued. Even then, the spiritual conquest was one of might and not of right. Swayed by fear and awed by authority, the people accepted the customs of Normans and made a superficial profession of accepting the papal doctrines. The deeper convictions of truth and liberty which prevailed in the days of the Celtic Church were smoothed under the weight of the invaders. The great work of AIDAN was apparently buried under utter darkness. Yet, centuries later, when the Reformation challenged the supremacy of the Rome, the seeds sown by AIDAN, Finan, and Coleman sprang forth to newness of life. The Church of the Wilderness bestirred herself, and a new day dawned, not only for England, but for the world.